Hello and welcome to Orenda Books at Bedtime. My name is West Camel and I'm here to introduce our readings to you in place of Karen Sullivan, who's taking a bit of a break. This week I am going to introduce you to The Evolution of Fear by Paul Hardesty. This book is the second in his series of action adventure thrillers starring the incredible Claymore Straker. Now Karen will admit that she is not the biggest fan of action thrillers, but when she read the first book in this series, The Abrupt Physics of Dying, she fell in love with the writing. What Paul does is he packs these books with all the adventure, the action, the fights of a great action thriller, but he also uses incredible literary language. And as an environmental scientist, he brings in a real authenticity into the topics that he covers, which are often about issues about the environment. The Evolution of Fear takes us from Cornwall to Istanbul to Cyprus, and Paul has travelled to all of these places, and if you read his books, you will go on a globe-trotting tour. So let me tell you a bit more about the Evolution of Fear. Claymore Straker is a fugitive with a price on his head, wanted by the CIA for acts of terrorism he did not commit. His best friend has just been murdered, and Rania, the woman he loves, has disappeared. Betrayed by those closest to him, he must flee the sanctuary of his safe house in Cornwall and track her down. As his pursuers close in, Clay follows Rania to Istanbul and then to Cyprus, where he is drawn into a violent struggle between the Russian mafia, Greek Cypriot extremists, and Turkish developers cashing in on the tourism boom. As the island of love descends into chaos and the horrific truth is unveiled, Clay must call on every ounce of skill and endurance to save Rania and put an end to the unimaginable destruction being wrought in the name of profit. It's a fascinating book, it's an exciting book, it's a romantic and heartbreaking book. Let's go over to Paul and hear him read from it.
Hi, my name's Paul Hardesty, the author of The Evolution of Fear, the second novel in the Claymore Straker series, and I'm here this morning down in Western Australia to read to you from the first chapter. Chapter 1, No Difference, the Instrument. 30th of October 1994, north coast of Cornwall, United Kingdom. It was a good place to hide. From almost any vantage, the cottage was invisible, notched into a wooded draw at the top of the bluff. Accessible only on foot, the place looked as cold and dead as the Devonian slate and mudstone cliffs from which it was made. 40 minutes now he'd been watching the place, as dusk faded and night came, but he'd seen no one, nothing to suggest danger. Just the crash of the waves on the shingle beach below, the whip of the wind through the trees. Claymore Straker shivered, pulled up his collar and watched the storm come in off the Irish Sea. Rain clouds scuttled overhead, low and fast, moving inland over the gorse and the stunted, wind-bent trees. The first drops touched his face, the cold fingertips of a wet 10-hour corpse. Winter was coming, and he was a fugitive. 8.5 weeks he'd been here, anchored into the cliffside, staring out at the grey solitude of the sea, watching the depressions deepen. 59 days, 1,422 hours, not knowing where she was, not knowing if she was alive or dead, uncertainty burning away the very fibre of him. And today, he'd cracked. He'd succumbed to worry and fear, and he'd walked all the way to Crackington Haven, 15 miles across the national park. Defying Crowbar's orders, he'd gone into the village, found a public phone, and he'd made a call. Just one. And now he was more worried than ever. Clay hefted his bug-out bag onto his shoulders and started towards the cottage. The path tunneled down through a tangle of wind-bent scrub, the branches closing over him as he went. Hands reached out from the darkness, snatched at his clothes. A thorn caught his cheek, nicked open the skin under his left eye. He cursed, bent low and followed the track as it swung back towards the cliffs. By the time he emerged from the thicket, the rain was coming hard and flat, squalling over the bluffs. He raised the stump of his left forearm over his eyes, trying to shield his face from the icy darts. There was the dark outline of the slate roof, the chimney pot just visible, the low stone wall that enclosed the small courtyard. He had just moved into open ground when the clouds broke. Moonlight bathed the cliff line like a parachute flare. And there, just outside the cottage door, the backlit silhouettes of two men. Clay stopped dead. A gust raked through the scrub, a loud tearing as a sheet of rain whipped over the bluff. The men were only meters away, blurs in the slanting rain. They were looking straight at him. Seconds passed, slowed to the tick of insect wings in a childhood dream, then stalled completely in chrome-white illumination. Surely they'd seen him. One of the men shifted, shook the rain from his coat. A voice rose above the wind. Clay couldn't make out the words, but the tone was calm, unhurried, as if commenting on the weather or the football scores. And in that moment, as the realization came to him that perhaps these men were simply lost, walkers strayed from the park, he thought how powerful are the doubts we carry inside, how strong these prisons we make for ourselves. He was about to raise his hand in greeting when the two men turned away and walked a few paces to the cottage. One bent to the lock, worked it a moment, and then pushed open the door. The other pulled a gun and burst inside. It was as if a gallows door had opened beneath his feet. Adrenaline hammered through him. He wavered a moment, then sprinted to the wall and dropped to the ground. A loud bang from inside the cottage amped out through the open door. A gunshot? A door being kicked in? Clay pulled the .45 caliber Glock G21 from under his jacket, cradled it dry in his lap, worked the action. He remembered Crowbar slamming the gun on the table the day he'd left him here. Stay put, his old platoon commander had said. I'll come get you when things calm. Whatever you do, stay clear of town. With that bounty on your carcass, every puss from here to Cape Town will be hunting you. Clay swallowed hard and then started along the base of the stone wall, keeping low. He reached the cottage, crouched and looked seaward across the courtyard. The door was less than 5 meters away. It was the only way in or out. He waited, listened, but all he could hear was the pounding of the surf and the wind buffeting the cliffs, and above it all the drowning crash of his own heart. How the hell had they found him, here of all places? Had someone recognized him in town? He'd been in and out in less than 20 minutes. Who, other than Crowbar, knew about this place, knew he was here? Questions boiled in his mind, but he didn't have time to think them through. The door opened and one of the men stepped out onto the rain-swept courtyard. He was short and stocky, powerfully built, and wore a black thigh-length raincoat and a black baseball cap. He took a few steps towards the wall, shoes crunching on the gravel. They were city shoes. Must have been wet through. A pistol with a long silencer hung from his left hand. He stood for a moment looking out to sea. Clay raised the G21, steadied it on the stump of his left arm, and aimed for the middle of the man's chest. Just then, the second man stepped out into the rain. He was taller, wore a dark jacket, and was bareheaded. Slung across his chest was a Heckler & Koch MP5 machine pistol. As Clay shifted his aim to take out the more heavily armed man first, the shorter man reached for his cap and pulled it off his head, slapping it against his thigh as he turned to face his companion. "He is niet here," he shouted above the rain. "Nun verlies er." Clay's heart lurched. The sound of his native tongue pierced something inside him. "He's not here," the man had said. A complete fuck-up. He said it in Afrikaans. "Ja, maar he was here," said the taller man, looking out towards the bluff. But he was here. The other man nodded. "Kan nee ver wees." Can't be far. Clay knelt behind the wall, the Glock trained on the men with the MP5. His hand was shaking. These were his countrymen, Boers by their accent, Men who by their look and demeanor had in all probability fought against the communists in Angola and Southwest Africa, as he had. Their presence here, in the foresight of his gun on the autumn night, on the north coast of Cornwall, seemed impossible. The ramifications, a nightmare. Clay knew he had to act quickly. He could run, disappear into the heathland, go west along the coast, give himself a head start. But they'd already managed to get this close. If he ran, they'd follow, just like they'd done with the Swapo terrorists all those years ago, tracking them like Paleolithic hunters, wearing them down with calloused feet, pushing them hour by hour towards the quicksand of exhaustion. It made no difference. The instrument? Helicopters or spears, stones or high-powered assault rifles. Even, as he'd learned to his horror, back then, during the war, the cocktails of muscle relaxants and incapacitating agents that shut down everything but your brain suffocated you as you fell to the sea from 4,000 meters, a silent scream drowning in your throat. Clay shuddered at the memory. The tall man turned, looked down the track, readjusted the sling of his weapon so its muzzle pointed down, and said something to his companion that Clay could not make out. A gap opened in the clouds. Moonlight flooded the gravel courtyard again, pale as a false spring day. The two figures stood silhouetted against the hammered steel background. Clay breathed in, steadied his aim. "I did not ask you to come here," he said. "I did not will this or want it in any way. I know why you are here, and I cannot let you leave. You have given me no choice. No choice." He exhaled, squeezed the trigger. The large caliber slug hit the tall one between the shoulder blades, severing his spine. His legs collapsed underneath him, and he sandbagged forward, inert, hands limp at his sides. Before the dead man's face hit the gravel, Clay shifted left, aimed for the other target, and fired again, this time to wound, to incapacitate, not to kill. The man spun right, fell to the ground, but then he was up, scrambling towards the cliffs, his feet flailing and slipping in the gravel. Clay was about to fire again when the lights went out, the moon suddenly obscured by a thick bank of cloud. The target was gone, black on black. Clay could hear the man scrabbling on the crushed stone. He aimed low along the wall of the cottage, fired blind once, twice, aiming at the sound, deflection shooting. Slowly his night vision returned. The tall one was where he'd fallen, face down, the rain pelting his back. Otherwise, the courtyard was empty.
Thank you, Paul. What a fantastic reading. I hope you enjoyed it. Come back next week for another episode of Orenda Books at Bedtime.